Hey there, and welcome to the Mercy Cast, where we are learning the art of compassion through the adversity of life. I'm your host, Raleigh Sadler. Today, I'm really excited because my guest is someone that I met when I was in Europe, traveling around, connecting with other people in the justice space, people who were really trying to think through how do we best care for our most vulnerable neighbors. And Becky Murray is one person who truly cares for her neighbors. She is the founder and CEO of One by One, an organization that aims to end exploitation around the world. And so when you get to sit down with people who have passions and callings like this, you always know that something's going to happen. These are people that want to see their neighbor cared for. You see, Becky's life was challenged upon meeting a 9-year-old girl living on the streets of Sierra Leone. After buying her a pair of flip-flops, which really cost less than $1, the little girl asked if she should wait in Becky's hotel room, presuming that she had bought her the shoes in exchange for sex. 15 years later, everything changed again after one phone call revealed the horrors going on inside the brick kilns of Pakistan. 3-year-old Mercy had been raped and murdered. Becky asked, "Where is God in the midst of such injustice?" Becky, welcome to the Mercy Cast.
I am so honored to be here. It's amazing to see you again.
Yeah, the last time I saw you, we were eating at Nando's Peri Peri Chicken.
Oh, the best chicken in the whole world.
So people don't know, like in the UK, there is this fascination for Nando's. And if you haven't had Nando's, how would you describe it, Becky?
Think of the most succulent chicken you have ever tasted in your life. Times that by 10 and then throw in some spices just to get things flowing. It is heaven on a plate.
And what I've noticed about the UK is you all love sauces. You have sauces for everything. And I think that might be why you also love Nando's, because you'll get everything and it will be like, can I get some more sauce? And they'll give you a whole bottle for your table.
That is very true. Although you guys do that across the pond as well. I don't think I've ever sat in a US restaurant where I've not been handed like an entire case full of like A1 sauce or something. So, just the British brothers are just copying you guys.
Well, or we're copying you, because at the end of the day, I thought about that as I said that. We love sauces as well. And one of the things I loved about the UK is you had sauces that I hadn't even heard of, and they were delicious. I am of the sort where I will go to another country, a country famous for their cuisine, and I will secretly want to put hot sauce on it. And this offends people, right? Like this makes them so angry because, I would be in Italy and I'd be like, this food is great, but they have hot sauce. And that is the quickest way to make people upset because it's not respecting the food. I get it. But I think when you've grown up with sauces, and it might be when you've grown up with sauces for a reason, like hot sauce helps you cover up some bland food, but then you get used to it. You just like that tang. You like that flavor, that spice, And so I really enjoyed that because we had a great conversation. We talked about how each other was called to address exploitation, address human trafficking, address vulnerability. And so this, for you, when you met this 9-year-old girl, kind of unpack what was happening for you as you were having this interaction.
Sure. Well, I've always been someone that was very passionate about justice. And so actually as a young girl, I thought I was going to go and study law. I thought I was going to be this lawyer who would tackle injustice through the law and, side note, earn money on the side as well. Happy days. But it turned out that God had a different plan and idea. And so I was on a short-term missions trip with my local church out in Sierra Leone. And it was probably one of my first ever mission trips. And so I was completely new to everything. And I spotted this little girl on the street. She was begging. Her mum and dad had both passed away. And so she would just beg on the streets to get by from day to day. And I simply noticed she had no shoes. Well, at that moment in time, I was a student. And so I certainly didn't have a great deal of money with me. I'd spent all my money on going on the missions trip.
Right.
And so with the tiny bit of money I had with me that day, which was the English equivalent of like 50 pence, so yeah, not even a dollar, I bought her a pair of little pink flip-flops to match the little pink t-shirt she was wearing that day. And if I'm honest, I thought it was an insignificant moment. It was literally just buying someone a pair of flip-flops. There was no big, grand moment there. Except that evening, she'd asked where the team were staying. And so she'd found our hotel and she approached and said, "Should I wait in the hotel for you?" Well, at that moment in time, myself and the team, we were literally just leaving to go on to this gospel campaign. And so I explained, no, I'm with this team, come and hear about this Jesus. And she said, "Yes, but shouldn't I wait in your bedroom?" Well, I think if this 9-year-old girl had asked one of the men on the team that question, I would have immediately understood what this little girl was asking. But as a young 20-something-year-old girl, I genuinely couldn't process what she was asking of me. I couldn't understand the question. So I'm like, "No, we're leaving. I don't understand." And so she explained that she thought I'd bought her the pink pair of flip-flops for 50 pence so that I could have her body in exchange. That moment so marked me. I think I come from such a beautiful upbringing, a very sheltered family. My concept of life when I was 9 years old was playing with dolls, and there was just such an innocence to my childhood. So to see a 9-year-old and hear from her lips that she presumed I now wanted to have sex with her because I'd spent such a tiny amount of money, it just broke me. Because the reality is, humans should never be bought or sold, ever. But for a 9-year-old child to think of another woman for the sake of 50 pence, that just messed me up.
Yeah, I can see how that would be jarring, especially when someone had become so accustomed to, if someone gives me something, then I have to give them something back in return.
Exactly that. I think she'd been so exploited living on the streets that if anybody had showed her any amount of kindness, no matter how big or small, I guess something had always been demanded in return for that. And I think the abuse that she must have endured, even by the age of 9, for her mind to go there for the sake of a pair of flip-flops, it made me more determined than ever. Because up until this moment, I'd had this dream and this promise in my heart about working with vulnerable kids and helping vulnerable kids. But all of a sudden, for a 9-year-old to look you in the eyes and presume it of you, she personalized a problem. She personalized a global issue. And all of a sudden, this became my non-negotiable moment of, I have to give my life to this. Not I want to give my life to this. I have to give my life to this because it's just so unjust.
So many people, we hear about injustice, and there's so many injustices around the world that it can be overwhelming. And sometimes we get this paralysis. We hear about it and we're like, well, maybe someone else will do it. And then sometimes we're thinking that we have to be a hero, that we have to either quit our jobs or do whatever. But in your story, you talk about doing one insignificant thing and that opened your eyes to your neighbor. How do you think other people can recognize their neighbors in the mundane and insignificant things?
I think that's exactly the key. I think sometimes we're waiting for these standout, like bolt of lightning kind of moments. But the reality is opportunities pass us by every single day if we would just have eyes to see.
That's right.
So it's anyone from, the mums at the school gate or, the neighbor who lives next door who's lonely and isolated. It's the member of our family who's, always angry at life. There's people right on our doorsteps if we would just open our eyes. And sometimes it's simply asking the question, are you okay? And then seeing where that leads. And we have no idea where that leads us. But if we have eyes to see, that's a great starting point. And then having a heart that says, okay, I don't know how to fix this problem, but let me at least help this one person in front of me right now.
And I love this. It's just the idea of starting where you are, helping this one person in front of me. And has this idea influenced even the name of your organization, One by One?
Exactly that. Exactly that. If you'd have said to me years ago, you'll be working with thousands of kids around the world, I'd have said, you've got the wrong girl. I'm quite shy by nature, don't think a great deal about myself. If you'd have said that, I would have laughed and said, you've got the wrong one. Pick someone who's far more louder and bolder than I am. But stop for one life. Okay, I can do that. I am capable of helping that one neighbor, that one person. And if we go through life with that attitude every single day, then before we know it, we will have impacted our whole community and the town where we live or the city that we go visit, our own country, as well as the nations of the world.
There's this story about Mother Teresa where someone was asking her, how did she come up with this plan to impact and really affect global poverty? And she looked at the person and she said, you start with the thing that's in front of you. And I think we're so busy and worried about what's going on over here, what's going on over there, that we miss the thing that's presenting itself to us. We're so scared about figuring out, well, what is my mission and what should I do and how do I give back? When if we open our eyes, that thing might be on our block. That thing may be in our community. What issues are presenting themselves to you? How would you help someone who's trying to figure out the issues in their community?
I'd simply say, open your eyes and see what's right there. Like, who's walking through the doors of your local church? Who's applying to your local food bank? I don't know if food bank relates in the same way in the US as it does in the UK. But who are the people who are vulnerable or isolated? Because they're the exact type of people that traffickers and people who want to exploit people are searching for and going after. But if we would use our eyes and be the ones to approach those people to say, are you okay? Then wow, watch what's at the other side of your yes.
And I think that's one thing your story really illustrates is there's this idea of you started there in Sierra Leone and you started pulling the thread. And then you started to see where you were being led. You started to see what God was doing. 15 years later, even, you get that phone call about the brick kilns of Pakistan. And I think for a lot of us, we think that we have to arrive immediately. Like, what is my calling? Well, our callings start small. God doesn't always give you your entire calling at the beginning. Sometimes he does. But sometimes he just gives you a passion. He gives you this holy discontent, this thing that bothers you, and it doesn't bother other people. And that's okay. Other things bother them. But this thing just gets under your skin and you have to do something about it. And then you address one thing and then it leads to another. And it leads to another. It leads to another. It's like watching a series on Netflix. You got to watch the next episode to get a bigger picture. And you got to watch the next episode and the next episode. And have you ever come to a point where you're in the middle of these episodes and you're like, I don't think I can do this anymore? Maybe you didn't have the perfect perspective, but you're like,
Yeah, all the time. I think in terms of how, whether you call it a calling, I'm a Christian. And so I believe the plans and purposes that God has over my life is what I'm following. And some people would say their mandate for life or, whatever. Like you said, what is it that you're passionate about? What is it that irritates you enough to make you go do something? And for me, the call that God gave me, I'm so glad he didn't tell me right at the very beginning of all the things we'd now be involved in and doing, because one of two things would have happened. Either I would have retracted and said, that's too big, that's too hard, I can't do that. And so I would have completely held back. Or I would have rushed ahead and tried to help God out, because obviously I'm a female. I can help you, God. Let me help you organize and strategize. And so I would have rushed ahead and tried to do things in my own way. But the joy of the journey I've been on is literally a need has presented itself in front of me. And I've said yes, one life at a time. So the first yes was that little girl with the flip flops. The second yes was starting to help vulnerable children in Kenya. As a result of that, I had a mum approach me asking for help because her child has gone missing. I found out human trafficking was happening in the village where we were based in Kenya. And so I said yes to that one mom. There was actually two moms in the space of 2 days that I said yes to. But as a result of that, we started our anti-trafficking educational program, which we thought was just for our tiny little village in Kenya. Little did we know where that would go. We'd reached almost 50,000 through that one program. But it was a result of that took us over to Pakistan.
Yeah.
And it was in that saying yes to Pakistan that we were then taken into the brick factories where I saw bonded labor for the first time in my life. And so it's been this journey of just saying yes to whatever need presents itself today. How today can I help to make a difference and an impact? And that one yes then leads to the next, which leads to the next. So suddenly I find myself in Pakistan, surrounded by people born into bonded labor. And it was this another moment, like looking at the 9-year-old in the eyes. This time I'm looking at a family who have, for the last 13 years, been working 14 hours a day, 365 days a year, just making bricks all day, every day. It was what's the next yes. The challenge for me in that moment, I remember having an internal conversation with God saying, where are you in this injustice? God, how can you be the creator of the heavens and the earth, and yet such pain and injustice exists in the earth? And I remember saying to him, God, where are you? Where are you in this injustice? And then all of a sudden, fast forward, I'm reading through the Bible and I see the last words in Malachi 2, the final words of that chapter are, where is the God of justice? And I was like, that's it right there. That's exactly what I've been feeling. Where are you, God, in the middle of this injustice? But the more I began to pray in this, the more I felt the challenge of, Becky, where are you in this? What are you going to do about this? It's so easy to sit back and point our fingers at everything that's wrong in the world. But well, then what are we going to do to make the wrongs right in some way in our own little world?
In my book, I quote Gary Haugen of International Justice Mission, and he talks about this idea of where is God in the middle of injustice? And he says, when I talk to people who've been trafficked or I talk to people who've experienced horrible things, their question is not, where was God? Their question is, where was God's people? Because at the end of the day, we know where God was. Jesus was acquainted with suffering. He lived, he died, he rose for us. If anyone knows suffering, it's God in the person of Jesus Christ. Jesus knows our suffering. He connects with us there. He became vulnerable to save those who are vulnerable. And so it's funny that that is how you got there as well, because I think that's such a natural progression of, God, where are you? And then you start to think, well, where am I?
Yeah.
What am I doing? And I love how your approach and even your organizational approach is so natural. It's like, let's just focus on the next thing. Let's be present in the moment. Let's not be looking over here, or looking over there, or let's just say, okay, if God is who he says he is, and he desires for me to love my neighbor, then who's my neighbor in my path? And I'm going to be here. And I can be here even if it's overwhelming, because God is here with me, because he always goes to those most vulnerable. God's not waiting for us to bring him to vulnerable people. He's already there and he's inviting us. And I just love how that is your calling. That's your passion. And that's what you have been inviting other people to do.
Exactly that. So even the scripture that I just quoted, the very next chapter, which is the continuation of the conversation of where is the God of justice? Malachi then goes on to say in verse 5 of the next chapter, God says this, I will speak against those who cheat employees of their wages, who oppress the widows and the orphans, who deprive the foreigners living amongst you of justice. And the beauty of God is he invites us in that calling. He invites us to join him in that, to be his hands and feet in the world today.
Well, you have told me a little bit about the work of One by One, but could you, just for the sake of our listeners, tell us a little bit about what you're doing, where you're doing it? What are some of the things that excite you about this work right now?
Yeah, sure. So we're involved in prevention, protection, and prosecution in terms of tackling slavery and bringing an end to exploitation. So our prevention work is through an arm called the Dignity Project, where we go in and we do a lot of educational work with children, educating them on, what does human trafficking look like? Does it look like being kidnapped off the street? Well, maybe that can rarely happen, but most often you're brought into it, you're manipulated into situations.
That's right.
So we go through the different tactics and strategies that are used by traffickers to try and empower these kids to stay safe against it. We also do training of police force across Kenya and Uganda of how to spot the signs and then how to do trauma-informed techniques when you're then dealing with the survivors. So that's kind of our prevention work. We also train up medical professionals because the one time someone trapped in slavery might be able to get help is because of a medical issue.
That's right.
So if a child in a brick factory has broken their arm, they can't work. So their slave master doesn't care less about the health of the child, but they do care about the profits. And so in order to get the profit, they have to go and get that bone fixed. Likewise for a girl in a brothel with yet another STD. And so if we can train medics on the front line of how to spot the signs that this might be more than just another patient, and then what to do so that they don't say the wrong thing in front of a trafficker who's posing as, a relative or a translator or whatever. And so that's our prevention work. Our protection work, we have residential centres in both Africa and Asia, where we've got a safe house for children that have been brought in out of slavery. Some of them are with us for a longer term in terms of there's more work to be done there before we can safely rehouse them back in families. Others we've been able to get back into family-centred care, which is always the main joy. And then in 2025, we're actually opening our first ever Mercy Centre, which is a shelter specifically for girls 17 and under that have been rescued out of trafficking. They'll come into our shelter for 3 to 6 months where we'll do all the trauma-informed help, get them counselling and see them healed up, give them courses, whether that's academic courses or life skill courses, so that once they graduate from the centre, they can go and do legitimate employment and live life to the full rather than going back into exploitation. And then finally, we also do a little bit of prosecution work in Rwanda in order to see justice for people that have gone through trafficking situations. And I believe through all that, through prevention, protection, and prosecution, we can start to see the giant of slavery finally coming down.
Well, and what I love about this approach is it's holistic, right? So many of us, we hear about something like human trafficking and we want to respond in the most primal and guttural way we can. We want to save the people, but we can't even save ourselves. And so oftentimes we would make it worse. But what I love about what you're doing is you're providing wraparound care, you're providing training, you're training the trainers in that sense. You are giving people the tools to where you can create a culture of freedom, a culture of caring for your neighbor. And I think that's where we have to address it, because what people don't know is human trafficking is not just something done by a few bad people. There is a culture that traffickers and those who are trafficked are part of. And there are so many layers and so many complexities that we do ourselves an injustice when we oversimplify it. But what I love about what you're doing is you're saying, well, what does it look like to see God's justice in the midst of injustice? And if we boil down justice, it's love of our neighbor, addressing the causes of the needs that we're seeing. And you're doing that. And I just love that. And so how would you encourage people who, maybe we're coming to this issue for the first time? We may have seen a movie about human trafficking. We hear about exploitation, but it doesn't really involve us. How would you encourage us to approach it from a holistic standpoint?
Yeah, I think so. The vast majority of people do think that it doesn't involve them. It's so far removed from their world that they don't need to worry about it. But the reality is, it's in every country, in every city, on every person's front doorstep. And so it does impact every single one of us, right down to where do we get our cars washed? Where do we buy our clothes from? We don't want to be unknowingly part of the problem. And if something's too good to be true price-wise, then someone somewhere is paying the price for that.
That's
right. If that latest fashion item is so cheap that it's a steal, well, ask yourself, well, who down the line is paying for that? Because someone somewhere is paying the cost. And so every single one of us needs to be aware of how we're living our own lives, let alone in terms of opening our eyes to see the vulnerabilities around us, to see the people in our own communities who need support, who need someone to come alongside them, who need to just ask the simple question, are you okay? And I think if we can live our lives that way, then we can be part of the solution rather than part of the problem.
Well, and you touched on this idea of how we can leave a footprint based on our choices, how we can create a demand for exploitation. How would you help us understand what part we play in it?
Yeah. I think supply chains are a big issue in terms of like commerce and industry. And so even the bricks that have been made in the lives that I've met, the families that I've had the honor of coming alongside and working with, they are making bricks that someone somewhere is buying. And I remember hearing someone once say, oh, these bricks aren't just like mass produced, they've been handmade. And for me, that was an alarm bell. But for them, that was a luxury, not realizing, well, whose hands have made those exact bricks? Yes, they're artisan. Yes, they're unique. But our little 3-year-old hands made those bricks. Because as much as that sounds unrealistic, I've met those 3-year-olds. I've walked around the brick factories and met children who never get to learn how to read or write because all they're doing is making bricks all day, every day. And it's not just bricks, it's carpets, it's fashion, it's a lot of different industries. It's impacting the beauty industry, car washes. It impacts so many parts of our lives, food even. And so I think being aware of where we're buying things from, do they have good supply chains? Do they even have checks in their supply chains? Or are they just constantly wanting the cheapest offer? Because as I said before, someone somewhere is paying that price.
You remind me of a time that I was in South Asia and I was in a bus, and the person who was kind of guiding us through said, over here is a brick kiln. This is something that we're trying to be aware of. And I took a picture. I'd never seen a brick kiln before. And I took a picture, and I get home later and I'm looking at the picture, and it was, your standard clay tiles on the top. And it was kind of like almost like a long A-shaped building. And then they had put a lot of dirt up against the road to where you really couldn't see in. But I got the perfect angle and I just took a picture. And as I'm looking at this picture, I thought it was just of the building and the darkness within it, because it was very dark inside of the building. And then I looked closer and there was a darker darkness. And I started to notice the outline of a woman, and she was holding a baby in the middle of the brick kiln. There was no one else, but here's this woman holding this baby. And I think you're exactly right. We want things at the cheapest price, but oftentimes we're not asking the question, who's ultimately paying the cost if this is so cheap for me? So when we go to that website to get all the deals, or we go to that shop, which has the lowest prices, or we buy the food in our grocery store or our market where these fish sticks are really, really, really cheap. We have to ask the question, why? And we've talked about this simple approach to neighboring where we say, okay, who is that person in our path? I'm going to care for that need. But I think another simple thing we can do is say, why? We look at labels for nutritional value when we buy goods. What would it look like to look for labels that are social in nature, like a fair trade label or a direct trade label, or labels that ultimately show how fair or free this item is, whether it's chocolate, coffee, soap? There's just so many things. What are your thoughts on that?
That's absolutely true. And I think sometimes as a consumer, you can convince yourself, well, I'm just one person. Like, I'm not the one who owns this factory. I'm not the one causing the injustice or the slavery. But actually, if there were no consumers, the brickmaster wouldn't keep selling the bricks. The coffee industry or the chocolate industry or the fast fashion industry wouldn't have anyone to sell to. If us as consumers would just become more aware and thoughtful of how we're spending, then it would make a dramatic impact. But it takes every single one of us to make that difference.
Yes. And I love how what you're saying is you're saying we want to address the holistic needs around us, but we also have to look within and address our own needs, because there's something in us that's driving us to spend our resources the way we do. And we'll never be part of this freedom movement until we realize that we're part of the reason for it. There's this part of us that we enjoy the lives that we have, but we've never stopped to ask, am I leaving a wake behind me, a wake of exploitation? You may not be an exploiter, but the things you buy or the things you watch, they're sowing into this culture that is ultimately hurting our neighbor.
Yeah, exactly that. We have to look first at ourselves and at what cost is our lives making an impact on others. Do we have a good impact? Are we leaving a good footprint on the world? Or actually, are we making people's lives around the world worse just because we've hunted down another bargain or a fake handbag or whatever it may be? But what impact is our choices making?
Well, and this is why I love what you're doing and what your organization is doing, because it's so close to my heart. Let my people go. Our goal is to help vulnerable people love other vulnerable people. And I think our vulnerability can be our superpower. And that's kind of what you're getting at. I think that's what you're addressing, is this idea that, yes, when we address vulnerability, we're going to be doing the work of prevention. We're going to be doing the work of intervention, and we're going to be doing the work of aftercare, but not necessarily because we're trying to. But when we get to know that vulnerable person in our path, they're going to have different needs. And I believe that God equips you for things sometimes in the moment. Like, you may not have the training, but all of a sudden you will realize, oh, I can reach out to this person, or I can check this website, or I can call this number. Because when you see that issue in front of you, especially for those of us who are believers, there's a desire, because the God of justice has saved us. So there's this desire to see justice happen. How would you encourage people who are starting to navigate this, maybe for the first time?
Yeah. I think, look what's in your hands today. As a Christian, I think of the story I learned as a very little girl about the boy with the loaves and fishes. And the joy of that story, for anyone who's never read the Bible, hasn't heard the Bible story, basically a little boy comes with his packed lunch of a fish sandwich. And Jesus takes that very insignificant fish sandwich and multiplies it so that 5,000 people get to eat. But the joy of that story is that little boy still gets to eat. That little boy doesn't go home with an hungry belly. He goes home with his belly full too. And it's the same in our lives. I think sometimes we live with our lives like we're clenching everything because we're so scared of losing the little we've got. Whether that's our time, whether that's our finance, whether that's just our social capacity, whatever it is. Sometimes we live like everything's clenched in because we're so scared that if we give it away, we'll go without.
Yeah.
But I find as a Christian, the more I live with my hands outstretched and what's in my hands today, how today can I love my neighbor? How today can I show the mercy and the grace and the justice of God through my own life? If we lived with our hands outstretched like that and an attitude like that, then I find that not only do I get to impact others, but my own life has been impacted and challenged. And I feel like I've learned so much from the very people I've had the joy of serving or working with. I've changed as a result of that. And I feel better as a result of that. So it's not like I've sacrificed and gone without, but it's actually as we've had this mentality of how can I give? How can I serve? How can I make a difference in my own community? In that same way, you're loved back, you've got that grace back, you've got that mercy back in your life too.
That's absolutely on point. And I appreciate you giving that to us. Before we end our time, you mentioned this new focus that One by One is taking, this Mercy Center. Could you tell us a little bit more about what the Mercy Center is and why it is such an important evolution in the ministry of One by One?
Yeah, so years ago, we had just gone through the global pandemic of COVID, which was a very challenging time for charities and nonprofits, as well as businesses. And it was just a challenging season. And even in my own personal world, it was just a difficult time. And so I remember sitting in my office, coming up with this master plan of survival for One by One, because at that moment in time, survival felt like success. And the plan was, we're not going to work with any more, children. We're not going to take on any new staff. We're not going to launch any new projects. We're just going to take care of the staff or the children already going through One by One's programs, because that felt wise and responsible. As soon as I'd put the little master plan together, my phone rings, and it was our team in Pakistan. And they'd just come back from yet another brick factory. We do an outreach into the brick factories to try and work with the families and the children there to get them any aid or help that we can. And the team rang and they said, we've just come back from a brick factory where a 3-year-old, we named her Mercy to protect the family's identity. The 3-year-old Mercy had been raped, and it was so severe that she died as a result of that. But then her little body was just left on the floor for people to walk past because 1, she's just a girl, and 2, she's just a slave. Well, my team were heartbroken and said, what can we do? I remember putting the phone down thinking, this is the worst timing ever. Like, we don't have spare funds. We don't have spare resources. What in the world do we do? But then when you contemplate the thought of a 3-year-old being raped and killed and then just tossed to the side like a piece of trash, how can you not respond to a situation like that? And so we actually, as a result of that, doubled the work that we were doing in Pakistan. We doubled the size of our safe house. We doubled the size of our outreach work. But it stayed with us. We knew there was more to be done. We fast forward to 2024. We've been working with the police in Jinji, Uganda, doing lots of training of how to spot the signs. And all of a sudden, the police start contacting us saying, we're now starting to recognize where do we put them until we can find their families. They had one little girl who was 6. She'd been sex trafficked for the last couple of years. She didn't even know the name of her family, let alone the name of the village where she came from. She had no idea. She was so little and so traumatized by what she'd just gone through. And so for the police to start locating her family, it takes a long time. And so they didn't know where to put her. Do you know what they had to do? They had to put her in a prison cell that night because it was the only bed they knew to put her on that was safe. But for a 6-year-old who's just endured such trauma to then be put in a prison cell, like, she doesn't know why she's now being punished for what she's endured.
Yeah.
And so they came to us and they said, we need a shelter. We need an urgent place where we can put them. And so yet again, we took a step of faith And we're calling it the Mercy Center in honor of the little girl, but also with the prayer that no child will have to go through what Mercy endured. And so we're calling it the Mercy Center, where these girls who have been identified by the police will be able to stay. It's a safe place where they can go through counseling and trauma therapy, as well as having educational classes and lifestyle classes. We want to see them healed before they're then located back into the local community. And so the police at that point and our own social workers will be able to go and work, find the family, and then check, is this family safe to rehouse this child back with? Or actually, were they a part of the trafficking problem? And so there'll be a lot of work to do around that as well. But our hope and our prayer is that this center will mean girls will not have to go through what Mercy endured over in Pakistan. And so my heart's hope, if that's the right word, is that this will be the first Mercy Center. I hope there's many more to come, but I hope through that to make a big impact to lives around the world.
And if someone had told you right when you were starting out that you were going to be creating Mercy Centers in Uganda, how do you think you would have responded?
I said, not me. I can't do that. I'm just a very normal person from a working class background myself. My dad was a postman. My mum was a cleaner. Come from a very working class background. I come from a town that's looked down on in our own surrounding area. And so I would have said, you've got the wrong girl. You need to go to someone who lives in London and comes from a financial background or a well-educated background, or from someone who's well-connected in politics, not just a normal person like me who's actually quite shy. But it turns out God can and will use anyone who's just willing to say yes. He's not looking for the most intelligent person or the richest person or the most well-connected person. He's simply looking for someone who will say yes to being part of the solution.
Right. Saying yes to that thing that's in front of you and addressing that need and seeing where that leads. I think that's something that we can all do. And I love how just throughout this conversation, that has been the theme. God isn't calling us to be heroes. He's calling us to be neighbors. And so how can we focus on this thing and then go to the next thing and go to the next thing? And I think that alleviates some of the stress and some of the pressure when we see things on TV or we read things online and we're immediately overwhelmed and we're like, I can't do that. Well, you can, but you start small. And then naturally you'll build up. You won't even be trying to build up, but you'll start to care. The burdens of the people that you're caring for will start to become your own. Then you'll start to advocate for that person. And as you're advocating for that person, you're seeing other needs and you're seeing unjust systems at work. And so now you want to address those. And it just kind of grows as you go. And I love how you gave us that picture. Becky, how can we get in touch with you?
So the website's always a great place to start. So that's onebyone.org. Or you can find us on social media, all the usual channels. Just look out for One by One and you'll find us there on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, everything. We're not on TikTok because we're not that cool.
No, I'm not on TikTok either. No, definitely not that cool.
I'm not that cool, that's for sure. My son will absolutely tell you that.
Becky, thank you so much. And it has been a pleasure. And honestly, now I want Nando's. And so I think I'm going to get online and just try to search out Nando's now. So listener, if you haven't had Nando's, find it, eat it. It's delicious. And then let us know what you think. But no, Becky, thank you so much for being on the Mercy Cast.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.